Our next speaker, Professor Mary McAleese, will need almost no introduction. She was elected the 8th President of Ireland in 1997, becoming the second female President of Ireland and the first woman in the world to succeed another as President. Since 2019, she's been Chancellor of Trinity College Dublin, where in 1975 she was appointed to the post of Professor of Criminal Law, Criminology and Penology. After retiring from political life, she gained a licentiate and doctorate in canon law. When a young Mary McAleese told a priest that she planned to become a lawyer, the priest dismissed the idea. She knew no one in the law, and she was female. The reality of what she went on to achieve, despite these obstacles, and despite a sectarian attack that forced her family to flee their home, is remarkable. In her recent book, Here's the Story, a memoir of family, war, peace and politics, she traces that astonishing arc from a tightly knit streets of North Belfast to a professorship in Dublin while still in her 20s, behind the scenes work on the peace process, and before her 2 terms as President of Ireland. She writes of her encounters with prime ministers, popes and royalty, with the same easy candour and intimacy with which she describes her childhood. And her account of the latest act in her remarkable career, quietly pursuing a doctorate and loudly opposing the misogyny she perceives in the Catholic Church, is an inspiration to many. Now, before I invite Mary to give us her long-awaited talk, I'm going to invite Joanna Moorhead to the stage. I will introduce her later, but Joanna, if you'd like to come up and join me, we're just delighted that you are here with us and with Mary. And do come and join us and settle in. Thank you. So, thank you, Mary, for opening our synod with your keynote talk to us. No synodality without freedom of speech. Canon law must acknowledge the human rights of church members. Over to you, Mary, in Rome.
Thank you very much, Mary. From one Mary to another. And Joanne, good to see you also. Sorry I can't be with you in person, but it's good to be at this synod in any form. Let's start just with a short extract from Mark. You put aside the commandment of God to cling to human traditions. It's a theme that will recur during the words I have to say. It wasn't so long ago that the big S word in the Catholic Church was scandal. It enveloped the church in an ecclesial winter. Today, another S word, synodality, promises an ecclesial springtime, to quote recent words from Cardinal Mario Grech, Secretary General of the Synod of Bishops. Many of us faithful would like to see that springtime, but our hopes are tempered by the belief that the church is at a critical crossroads in its history. And if it fails to choose the right path, it risks an enduring permafrost. Pope Francis seemed to understand this predicament and the surging tide of distrust of a culpable episcopacy when shortly after his election he said that the future lay with developing a synodal church at every level, which would be a listening church whose members would walk and talk together with freedom of speech, and where what affects all would be discussed by all, as was the case in the early church. Those words brought optimism, and a new energy seemed to break through the pervasive demoralization. In good faith responses to Pope Francis's words, some diocesan synods have been held, or are planned. National Episcopal synodal processes are already underway in Germany, Australia, South America, Italy, and Ireland. And there is, of course, this uniquely lay-led root and branch synod, which has no geographical boundaries. In addition, there is the surprise initiative of Francis, who announced that in October of this year, just next month, a synodal process will commence throughout the Universal Church, which will culminate in a Synod of Bishops in Rome in 2023. It will have the theme for a synodal church, communion, participation, and mission. Now, Pope Francis and the Synod Office have set out the terms on which we lay church members may participate in this forthcoming synod. Now we set out our terms, because theirs are frankly missing a few important issues. Synodality is a concept which, I want to just make a case here that while there is real value in developing a new culture of synodality with this great word, synodality, synodality will only work. In fact, the future of the church, frankly, will only work if it's firmly set in the context where there is an unequivocal acceptance that church members, all of them, are entitled within the church and in all its laws and all its processes, including synodal processes, they are entitled to the inalienable human rights that are set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. Those rights include the equality of men and women, their intellectual rights to freedom of expression, speech, thought, opinion, belief, conscience, including the right to their own religion, of course, and the right to change religion. Church canon law currently imposes limits on all of those and restrictions on all of those rights. And I regret to say that it is already clear that Pope Francis's notion of synodality does not very likely include these matters for discussion, yet they urgently need to be discussed. Synodality itself is a concept which is not referred to, much less defined, in any document of Vatican II, nor in the 1983 Code of Canon Law. Pope Francis admitted it's easier to name it than explain it. And the International Theological Commission, just 2 years ago, back in 2018, said the very word synodality is a linguistic novelty which needs, wait for it, careful theological clarification. Well, there has been very little theological clarification, but there has been a welter of hastily constructed legal clarification, including from Pope Francis. And this week, we got a rambling preparatory document from the Office of the Synod of Bishops, while telling us, as if we needed to be told, that we are at a crucial transition in the life of the Church, which cannot be ignored. It managed to remarkably ignore fundamental questions of your rights and mine as church members, which are actually at the very heart of this so-called crucial transition. Without a change of course, there is little likelihood the forthcoming synod on synodality will deliver a measurable ecclesial thaw. Greater hope lies here in this lay-led synod and in the German synod, both of which offer a progressive model of synodality based on principles which on current form will be absent from the Synod of Bishops synod on synodality. Those are namely equality of all church members, freedom of speech, and agendas that are fully open to discussion of contentious issues. We have to hope and pray that enough faithful in every diocese, including laity, religious, priests and bishops and cardinals, will find the courage to insist that the recognition in church law of the equality and intellectual freedoms of all church members must be a priority in all the national episcopal reports that will go to Rome for the 2023 Synod. Frankly, if that happens, the Church will likely have to hit the most important reset button it has ever hit in its history. Despite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Church has continued to teach the magisterium, that is the bishops, have the unchallengeable right to restrict your rights and mine as church members. It says it can legitimately do that because of personal promises we made at baptism, and those promises imposed on us compulsory lifelong obligations of church membership. Now, those obligations include obedience to the magisterium, accepting magisterial teachings we find unpalatable, refraining from dissent in order to maintain communion. In other words, by our baptismal promises, we are deemed to have accepted the right of the magisterium to impose limitations on our freedom of expression, opinion, conscience, belief, religion, and right to change religion. The Second Vatican Council disgracefully dissembled on this very issue in its declaration on religious freedom, Dignitatis Humanae. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard people talking rubbish about Dignitatis Humanae. That document recognized only that those outside the church had the right not to be coerced into it, into what they called embracing the faith. In small weasel print, it ignored the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and continued the magisterial claim that everybody who'd already been baptized in the Catholic Church was bound by the fixed obligations of membership from which they could not freely escape. In my view, this understanding of magisterial control over church members is risible and no longer sustainable in the light of how we now see human rights. For generations, it has been based on unshakable presumptions which have shaped and protected a dominant church culture of celibate male hierarchicalism and clericalism, which silenced and indeed scorned the voices of the faithful, especially the laity, especially women, and especially those who dissent, both lay and clerical. In fact, sometimes the clergy have experienced much greater repression in that regard. It has resulted in a dysfunctional, top-heavy edifice with unhealthy repression of internal discussion. It has facilitated unaccountable and indeed untrustworthy episcopal management of the church by company men rather than Christ's men. And it has led to the long shelf life of unenlightened and damaging teachings and practices to the detriment not just of the church, but of humanity. For the Catholic Church is a global key influencer with a membership of 1/6 of the world's entire population. It operates in 5 continents. It is the biggest NGO in the world by far. It should be, it could be leading by example, practicing equality and freedom of expression as gifts from God. But instead, it freezes its own progress and that of entire cultures and genders by clinging to an archaic imperial model of control. That model purports to make each of us permanently indentured, not to the great liberating commandment of Christ to love one another, but to the authoritarianism of the magisterium, no matter how wrong-headed, how dangerous, or how unchristian that magisterium, and it has been all those things over the course of history, including right up to the present day. I want to argue that we have arrived at a watershed where before we can go forward as a church from the current paralysis, we must reform these long overlooked foundational presumptions that dare to limit your fundamental rights, my fundamental rights, our fundamental God-given faculties and freedoms to make up our own minds, to speak with our own voices, to inform our own consciences, to make our own contribution to that which affects us in the church. What God has given, the church has no right to take away, but it does that. And it does that with its appeal to the binding nature of obligations based on baptismal promises. Let me just talk about those binding promises for a moment, because it's time for us to make the case that these were fictitious for most of us. I was baptized at 2 weeks old. I made no promises. How could I? My parents were hoping I'd sleep through the whole thing. I probably didn't. It is time for us to say out loud that fictitious baptismal promises made by non-sentient babies, which is the case for 84% of us worldwide, and even frankly, actual promises made by adult catechumens, we can no longer rely on them to justify depriving church members in perpetuity of their inalienable human rights to make up their own minds, offer their own opinions, dissent from the magisterium, challenge the magisterium, as well as change their minds entirely about church membership. Let me be clear, because a lot of people don't really understand this argument or try to avoid understanding it by saying it's about infant baptism. It's not. I'm perfectly happy with infant baptism. It's normative in the church. In itself, it's not the problem. What's problematic of the magisterium to separate out from that wonderful sacrament two, and the other of which is the man-made consequence of baptism. And it's the man-made consequence which is problematic. The divine theological effects of baptism directed towards salvation are very beautiful. The gifts of divine grace that open up the pathway to salvation, free us from original sin, incorporate us into the body of Christ, and then give us that great gift of salvific grace that enters our souls as a leaven. And it's unceasingly available to us over our lifetime. It invites us into a relationship with Christ, doesn't command, doesn't coerce, doesn't force, it invites. We're free to accept it or reject it again and again, day by day over our lifetime. The man-made consequences of baptism found in canon law are not free, and they are certainly not of divine origin. They are bolted on rather opportunistically to the sacrament of baptism to compel lifelong enrollment as members for life of the church, to impose a once and for all acceptance of the obligations of membership. At a time, as I say, when the vast majority of us are simply not in a position, A, to make promises, or B, to understand the nature of the obligations. And yet these obligations purport to hold us forever in a relationship of subservience and submission, not to Christ, but to the sacred pastors, who of course have made such a great job of the church, as we all know. Since their power over us stems from promises the vast majority of us never made, I think it's quite legitimate to ask, did anyone have the right to make those promises on our behalf? What is the legitimate basis today? Is there a legitimate basis for those promises today? And that sounds to me very like an appropriate question for a synod where what affects all is discussed by all. I still remember with horror when our parish priest reprimanded my mother. She was then the age of 39, in front of all her family and her husband, because she'd had a hysterectomy without his permission, while she was still of childbearing age. She was 39. She had had 11 pregnancies, 9 live children aged from 18 to newborn, and she was in life-threatening danger from hemorrhage when she got her hysterectomy. And then it was a case of everything about us, without us. It still is. And sadly, Pope Francis' vision of synodality will not change that on current plans unless voices from this synod, from Germany and from elsewhere interrupt what is being planned about us, without us, even as we speak here. So let's just take a closer look at that. Those who have followed Pope Francis's last 4 synods will be familiar with the cautious choreography of the synodal process about to be launched next month. We're told there will be 3 phases. Now, that's already not right. That's completely incorrect. We've already had one, but let me just come back to that. But we're told there will be 3 phases. The first is a so-called diocesan consultative phase, which will reach out to all the faithful, including the 1.3 billion laity. It will seek their views through responses to questionnaires circulated at diocesan level. In reality, this will be a first phase in name only, for it will have been preceded already by a detailed design and drafting process carried out by officials in the office of the Synod of Bishops. Already they just published their, and I mean their, preparatory document. And it shows signs that, as usual, it has been meticulously designed to forestall feedback from the faithful on contested magisterial teaching or neglected matters like the recognition of the equality or intellectual human rights of church members. So after laborious local consultation on what the central office calls, with language that everybody understands, 10 thematic nuclei, I apologize in advance for using that phrase. The discernment, second phrase, the discernment or continental phase begins. It involves only the bishops of the episcopal conferences. They gather the responses to the questionnaires and then in private and with complete editorial control, they will distill them into reports which will go to the Synod office in Rome. Once there, again in private, they will be filtered by synodal officials into the working documents for the 3rd phase, that is the deliberation or conclusive phase in Rome. That final phase will, of course, take place at the formal gathering of the Synod of Bishops in October 2023. By then, by the time we get to 2023, Pope Francis's alluring language of journeying together will be long redundant because the laity disappear from the journey at the end of phase 1 and a process of secret sanitizing takes over. From that point on, phase 2, phase 3, only the bishops will journey together. Past practice indicates that with a few noble exceptions, episcopal conferences do not openly publish their full reports. Past practice has been that synods of bishops are held in camera with only a tiny handful of invited laity in attendance, and among them a risible token presence of women. And you can be sure that the latter will be preposterously talked up by Vatican officials as if we can't do simple maths. The synod will likely end by agreeing a papally approved synod report, or there will be a post-synodal apostolic exhortation from the Pope, which will inform, for good or ill, the shape of synodality for decades to come. So it's darned important. And it's important they get it right. Pope Francis claims that this absurd process, by some strange alchemy, will honor the principle that was dear to the Church of the first millennium, quod omnes tangit ab omnibus tractari debet. What affects all should be discussed by all. It won't be. It is deliberately designed not to. Pope Francis claims it is designed to avoid a kind of parliamentarism of the faithful. God forbid. In reality, it merely continues an exclusive episcopal parliamentarism, a secret parliamentarism. Fortunately for the laity, the Synod office in Rome has said that submissions from individuals or groups of faithful will be welcome outside of the episcopal-led synodal process. So notionally then, this lay-led synod has the opportunity and importantly the right to directly send its own report to the Synod office, and it could indeed eventually inform the discussion in Rome. However, the principles on which this root and branch synod are based pose a real challenge to the magisterium and the Rome Synod. Why? Simply by virtue of insisting on an open agenda, freedom of speech, and co-equal citizenship of all church members. These are the very things that got the German Synod into trouble, and their story is as instructive as it is very disappointing. The German Church's national synodal journey was begun in good faith in 2019 in direct response to Pope Francis's rousing call for a new and meaningful synodality. It also began in direct response to demands for church reform from a body of German faithful who were deeply demoralized by serial sex abuse scandals, episcopal mismanagement, and a raft of other things, clamoring for frank internal discussion with their sacred pastors. Like many of us, they were faithful, they were fed up with the futility of simply talking among themselves. Many saw Pope Francis's call to a new, inclusive, free speech synodality as a sign of the Holy Spirit at work, that he had at last got off the sub's bench. There can be no doubt that the General Secretary to the Synod of Bishops, Cardinal Grech, and Pope Francis raised reasonable expectations and hopes of such a radical form of synodality in stirring and sweeping claims. Cardinal Grech, for example, said, Pope Francis has inaugurated a new style of synods marked by a real freedom of speech. And Pope Francis said that his synods would always obey that principle so dear to the Church of the first millennium, quod omnes tangit ad omnibus tractari debet, what affects all should be discussed by all. On the face of it then, nothing could have been closer to Pope Francis's vision of his new form of synodality than the synodal process initiated in Germany. It was a collaboration between the German Bishops' Conference and the laity-led Central Committee of German Catholics, the ZDK. They agreed between them, before they started, on principles, on equality of voting between the clergy, laity, and bishops. And they agreed there would be a discussion of many contentious matters, including sexual morality and women in church ministries. It was and it remains a model of free speech, co-responsibility, and discussion of what affects all by all. Yet, within weeks, the German Synod had run into serious trouble with, guess what? The Holy See. The progressive papal messages which the German Synod had legitimately taken at face value were subsequently contradicted by none other than Pope Francis himself in another of his classic, exasperating U-turns. Pope Francis responded to the German synodal process with alarm almost immediately in June 2019. He warned against what he termed a false synodality that wanted to tidy up the church and conform it to contemporary logic. I can't see what's wrong with that, actually. He advised that the agenda of the German Synod should switch to, guess what? Discussing evangelism, and should not discuss or make decisions on matters which were the subject of teachings for the universal church. The German Synod, God bless them, decided against a discussion on evangelism, and they continued on as planned. Cardinal Ouellet, the head of the Congregation of Bishops, then wrote to the German bishops in stern, legalistic terms, bring up the canon law canons, telling them their synod was not ecclesiologically valid, that in canon law, it wasn't a synod at all. It was a particular council, and as such needed papal approval and terms of reference set by the Pope, neither of which it had. Next, in March 2021, draft German proposals on ideas for an inclusive, welcoming church, which would allow blessings for a Catholic same-sex civilly married couple who were looking for a blessing to get one from a priest. These were, before they even got as far as Rome, they were preemptively dismissed by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith with papal approval. Such blessings were banned, said the CDF. And then they went on to say an awful language. And they're banned why? Because gay Catholics in civil marriages are incapable of either receiving or expressing God's grace. That happened in what we call Ireland St. Patrick's Week. That was the week when Irish clergy were busy blessing pot plants of shamrock. It got worse. For the avoidance of the very doubt that he had created himself, Pope Francis, in his recent book, Let Us Dream, firmly rolled back on any prospect of a ground-up progressive model of synodality, saying, in speaking of synodality, it's important not to confuse Catholic doctrine and tradition with the Church's norms and practices. What is under discussion at synodal gatherings are not traditional truths of Christian doctrine. The synod is concerned mainly with how teaching can be lived and applied in the changing contexts of our time. Synods, therefore, according to Pope Francis, are not places for robust open debate with freedom of speech on contentious magisterial teaching and practices, but rather are protected zones for that very teaching. And we are supposed to confine our discussion to how those teachings can be successfully applied in our contemporary context. Pointless does not even get close. It is difficult to see how this honours the principle, nothing about us without us, as Francis claims. It's equally difficult to see how this model of gagged synodality will deliver an ecclesial spring. Hypothermia, yes, an ecclesial spring, no. More likely, it will simply prolong the ecclesial winter and ice over the green shoots of hope. Current church law puts a padlock on our intellectual human rights, which Newman's educated laity now seeks to unlock in order to facilitate the mature, the fearless open debate among equals that alone can make the church a credible 21st century guide to evangelism for Christ and to salvation. Removal of that padlock is a task for Pope Francis as supreme legislator. It is key to his synod on synodality having any chance of success. Yet, in the literally hundreds of thousands of words that he has written and said, including Fratelli Tutti, your human rights and mine as church members have not featured ever at all. It is time they did. For, to put his own words back to him in Fratelli Tutti, he says, we say one thing with words, but our decisions and reality tell another story. Yes, they most certainly do. While many leave the church, others hang on in hope of reform, believing that despite its often appalling history, this church can become the humble, believable, salvific service to the world that Christ intended, and indeed that many, many faithful have lived, but only when it is finally free of the structural dysfunction which has created the magisterial mess that Pope Francis does not want us to tidy up. And what a mess it is. Many of us are in growing despair of our church's inability to self-critique. It can turn a critical spotlight on the world at large instantly, but on the self, internally in the church, no. That is a difficult thing for it to do. We are in despair of its indulgence in historical amnesia. The amnesia about having been wrong about so many things in the past. Its default to piousness and hagiography, its capacity for dissembling, dignitatis humanae, for smugly blaming everything but itself for internal problems, its controlling clericalism, its cavalier misogyny, its evil homophobia, its institutional and clerical child sexual and physical abuse, its episcopal cover-ups that protected criminals and ignored victims, its lack of financial transparency and accountability, its burdening of aging, tired and discouraged clergy, rather than face internal responsibility for the collapse in vocations, its refusal to let those most affected, for example, by Humanae Vitae, into the internal debate, its failure to honour obligations under human rights treaties, its hypocrisy in preaching justice, equality, inclusion, diversity, and due process to the world at large, while failing to practice all of the above internally. Its relentless external advocacy on behalf of the right to life of the unborn, while utterly hypocritically ignoring the fact that the Church, whose primary mission is salvation, itself teaches that it cannot guarantee the salvation of the little babies, 80 million of them, born unbaptized every year, who die through natural miscarriage, abortion, and stillbirth. Remarkable. Its external championing of environmental responsibility, while failing to mitigate the environmental damage and the social and the financial waste caused by the enormous stockpiled portfolio of unsustainable, underused, and unused property owned by the Church, the biggest non-governmental owner of private property in the world. Need I mention the glacial pace of ecumenism, intercommunion, sacramental access for the divorced and remarried? Look, the list just goes on and on and on, and with it, the magisterial Church goes more disconnected from Christ as the shallow well of decision-making ability it draws from dries up. Now, we would like to discuss these things, possibly not all on the same day, but we would like to discuss these things and to contribute to their resolution in an official, standing, inclusive forum within the Church for the good of the Church. No such forum exists, which is why this root and branch synod created one to draw attention to this rather important lacuna. Pope Francis's notion of synodality, which once seemed to capture the zeitgeist favouring all-inclusive church debating fora, now seems bent on preventing it at worst or micromanaging it into irrelevance at best, unless and until the magisterial Church acknowledges the full equality of all as church citizens, unless there's an acknowledgement of members' inalienable rights to freedom of speech, expression, opinion, conscience, belief, religion, right to change religion, then frankly, all official church synods, whether they are diocesan or national or the Synod of Bishops, will be as anodyne and embarrassingly ineffectual as every single Synod of Bishops has been since its inception in 1965. That includes Francis's 4 synods, which, although extravagantly hyped, despite their very large clerical carbon footprint, have all been expensive, protracted, and inconclusive anticlimaxes, testifying only to the hopeless inadequacy of the Church's official synodal model. In fact, its hopelessly out-of-date model of powerless membership and powerful magisterium. The Church is going to keep on hemorrhaging members, and it's going to experience a lessening of its external and internal impact unless it shifts from a culture of imposed obligations to a culture of invitation, from a catechesis of imposed obligation to a catechesis of open invitation, until it makes all of us catechumens. In such an open culture, the divine baptismal graces can flow liberally. In our magisterial control culture, they are blockaded, and we are spiritually infantilized, while the magisterium tells us they have all the answers and we have no right to ask the questions. Yet, more in hope than expectation, we meet here in good faith in response to Pope Francis's call for a more synodal church, because somehow we still believe in miracles. Canon 212.3 of the Code of Canon Law, 1983, says that Christ's faithful have the right, indeed at times the duty, in keeping with their knowledge, their competence and position, to manifest to the sacred pastors their views on matters which concern the good of the church. They have the right also to make their views known to others of Christ's faithful. That's what we're doing here. So far, so encouraging of this phenomenal resource that is the insight, wisdom and experience, brain power of the faithful. But this canon isn't a freedom charter. Just listen to how it then starts. On the one hand, here's the open right, but here on the other hand are the obligations. We must always respect the integrity of faith and morals. Just excuse me while I make my battery, get my battery back on again. But this is, we must always respect the integrity of faith and morals. We must always show due reverence to our sacred pastors. We are bound to show Christian obedience to what the sacred pastors who represent Christ declare as teachers of the faith and prescribe as rulers of the church. And we are bound to preserve our communion with the church at all times, even in our external actions. Look, it's long past time that these canons were revised to acknowledge the transcendent, overarching inalienability of the intellectual human rights, fundamental intellectual freedoms of the faithful, above all their right to be involved ab initio in the making of decisions that profoundly affect them. Canon law also needs to address the rights of children, as set out in the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989, to which the Holy See is a very, very neglectful state party. The Convention provides that while parents have, of course, the absolute right to baptize their infants and raise them in the faith, they must also acknowledge and respect the child's right to make up its own mind about membership and doctrine and teachings when it is capable of doing so. The Holy See is obliged to honour those principles in its laws and practices. It does not currently do so. If it was to do so, funnily enough, we could quickly have a healthy church of convinced volunteers, held not by imposed obligations, but by freely offered real personal passion for the gospel and the power of God's love. Such a healthy church has a chance, at least, of being more evangelically convincing about Christ and ridding itself of the accumulated vanities of history, which have ossified faith into ersatz duty and obligation. Such a church could usefully discuss evangelism, but not this church, not yet. We should be in no doubt that this is a defining moment in the contemporary church. Pope Francis's hasty, populist push for an ill-defined synodality was at least a recognition that something had to give. This root and branch-led synod, with its clarity and its coherence about what it wants from synodality, what it wants for the church of the future, about relationships within this forum, the equality, the listening, that has a huge chance to play now a unique historic role in shifting the internal church roadblocks. But there's a shocking reality here that I very rarely hear talked about. And it is that despite a really very strong contrary narrative, lay participation in the church has been consistently frozen out, while episcopal power has become even more strongly consolidated in the 20th and 21st centuries, the very centuries that saw the emergence of a massified, educated laity, and which were supposed to see a wide conciliar embrace of lay charisms. Didn't happen. The 1917 Code of Canon Law, God help us, had provided that there would be provincial councils with lay participation in each ecclesiastical province every 20 years. That never happened. Why? Because it relied on episcopal initiation, and with very rare exceptions, diocesan synods and national regional councils fell out of fashion in the last century and this century. And so that very limited, but at least place-keeping form of lay participation was mostly lost to the Church. The post-Vatican Council years, which it was hoped would lead to greater scope for lay participation, instead saw the consolidation, augmentation of the power of these newfangled episcopal conferences, made up entirely of bishops with no clear role for the laity whatever, apart from limited service and optional committees, well away from teaching and doctrine. And then the creation, of course, of that great institution, the Synod of Bishops, a new advisory body to the bishops created by Pope Paul VI in 1965, again with no formal provision for representation of the laity. Thomas Rees, who attended those synods, says of them, they were often an embarrassment. The entire process was carefully stage managed by Vatican officials, and bishops who ignored the playbook got slapped down. Nothing new there. Francis was himself critical of the Synod of Bishops, saying shortly after his election, we must give them a less rigid form. I do not want token consultations, but real consultations. He called on each diocesan bishop to listen to everyone, and not simply those who would tell him what he would like to hear. Those are Francis's words, not mine. And those words of Pope Francis, and many, many more in a similar vein, were honourably interpreted as papal encouragement to do precisely what the German Synod is doing and what we are doing here. Pope Francis will be held to his words. He will be judged on them by history, for the synodal genie is well and truly out of the bottle. It has provoked an unfortunate, panicked, curial and papal retrenchment, but it has also energized many faithful across the universal church. Why? Because this is their church. This is our church too. There's an old Irish joke told about foreign tourists who are lost on a narrow, winding country road, and they stop to ask a local farmer for directions to the town which is their destination. And he says to them, well, if that's where you're going, I wouldn't start from here if I were you. That is a near to exact description of Pope Francis's disorganized, unmapped journey towards a synodal church. And yet it's where we are. On present form, unless something miraculous interrupts the current Francis trajectory, our destination will be a dead end called bitter disappointment. But this synod could well be that miracle. Lay-led synodal processes like this can showcase to the church in general and the magisterium in particular what it is like, what it feels like to be an equal citizen of the church, how to respectfully embrace freedom of speech, how to listen to one another, how to hear with open hearing, how to trust the voices of lay men and women who care about the church and who are open to guidance from the Holy Spirit, how to listen to other voices that have never had a chance to be heard. Their fresh wisdom may yet provide answers to problems that a decomposing hierarchical infrastructure cannot face and cannot find the answers to. The only way this synod is able to offer real freedom of speech and an open agenda dedicated to best practice of the great commandment to love one another is actually by ignoring the constraints imposed by the magisterium, by canon law, and insisting that our human rights are not trumped by church law, but are in fact violated by it. By drawing that reality to the attention of the forthcoming synod, there is even at this last minute some timely hope of vindicating Cardinal Greg's claim that Pope Francis's synods have a new style that is marked by a real freedom of speech. The great man for the hyperbole, Cardinal Greg. Pope Francis has warned of a false synodality that wants to tidy up the church. Honestly, Pope Francis, if ever an institution needed to be tidied up It is our church. For we face an unholy mess created by the systemic, dishonourable abuse of grandiose clerical power. It has flattened the faithful. We should be glad of the miracle unfolding here, that there are people prepared to pick themselves up and stand up and help tidy up that magisterial mess, not with unchristian episcopal cover-ups, but with Christian candour. Our kind of synodality can lead to a new kind of communion, finally worthy of Christ, who is, after all, the very author of our inalienable human rights and fundamental freedoms, who stands foursquare with us as we demand of the magisterium that it listens while we use the voice he gave us, while we use the rights he gave us, to demand from them those rights. He stands foursquare with us, and we ask the magisterium, we ask our pope, we ask our bishops, we ask our clergy to stand with us and demand that our rights are fully honoured by our church, and that in honouring those rights, it honours Christ himself, as we do here at this synod in his holy name. Pope Francis said, this is a moment to dream big, and that is what we are doing. And we invite the Pope and the magisterium to enter our dream for our church. Thank you for listening, and thank you so much for this wonderful synod.
Thank you, Mary. I don't suppose you can see it from where you are, but the room rose to its feet with its cheering there. I don't know if the sound reached you in Rome, but it should have done.
Well, thank you. It didn't, but I'm delighted to hear it. Thank you.
Mary, to give you a pause to grab a glass of water or whatever you need, I'm going to take a moment to introduce Joanna Moorhead to the assembled gathering. But first I must say that words completely fail me to respond to your speech. I will simply remember that I lived to hear it. Joanna, who has so kindly come today to put your questions, most particularly people online, I'll explain in a minute about here in the room. Joanna was deputy editor of the Catholic Herald 30 years ago, and at the same time joined a Catholic feminist group. I must put in that Root and Branch would not be here without Joanna. She wrote in January 2020 that what our church needs is a synod that, instead of ending with women, begins with them and doesn't stop there. And a small core of us heard these words, looked at each other, wrote to Joanna, and to our astonishment, she replied. And then we wrote to Mary, and to our even greater astonishment, Mary replied. And the little seedling of Root and Branch was born, and so we thank you both. It's Now, as a freelance journalist, Joanna has written for the major UK newspapers, especially The Guardian, The Observer, and many books. The Surreal Life of Leonora Carrington was recently Book of the Week on BBC Radio 4. Joanna is arts editor of The Tablet, and last year she did indeed write that famous article that prompted Root and Branch into being. Now, just on a practical note, whilst I find the reminder on my laptop. If you are online, you simply go to the ticket holders page to look for RB Synod Chat. That's all one word, lowercase, RB Synod Chat at gmail.com, and type your questions in. We'll wait and see whether the internet breaks under the strain, if it holds up. Such questions as we can take will be passed here to Joanna to put to Mary for Mary's answers. Here on the floor, we can take a couple of questions. We're doing this as much by numbers as anything because there are hundreds of people on the internet waiting, whom we can't see, waiting to get their questions in. So we have a couple of roving mics ready to go to the floor, and we will, if you've got a question and you would like to put your hand up, the mics won't come to you just yet, but put your hand up if you think you have a question, and we will try to get it to you in time. Well, in fact, I think we'll give you time to think about that and start with some of the ones from the internet.
Mary, could I just say a quick thing to Mary and ask a quick question myself, very quickly?
Please do.
Hello,
I was
Joanna.
Hi, Mary. I was just going to say that when I was a member of the Catholic feminist group that became Catholic Women's Ordination 30 years ago, Myra, who you saw at the top of this afternoon speaking to us, was a big part of that. And it was in the wake of the Romanian Revolution, which many of you will remember, the Ceausescu story, and so on. And I remember Myra Poole saying, "This is how we will have to be. This is what we will have to do. Because people in Rome will not listen. They will not listen until we go along to Rome and, invade." And I thought, I'm being perfectly honest now, that Myra was a bit bonkers. So 30 years have gone by, and now I regard what Myra said as extremely wise and prophetic. And I just wanted to ask Mary, not when will the penny drop in Rome, or when will the penny drop with the hierarchy? I think as you've said really in what you were saying there, it's begun to drop. And for many of them, it's not that the penny, that we're on the wrong track, but what do they do? How do they respond? But the question I wonder is, how will the penny drop? What will happen? Will it be like Myra said all those years ago?
This I don't know the answer to, Joanna, because these are people who have, for the most part, been formed in a particular way that introduces them to almost a kind of a smug self-righteousness, that when they hear voices like ours, they may be listening, but they're actually shouting back as they're listening, "I don't have to listen to you, because you're not a person worthy of being listened to." That has been the problem all the way through, that even when they have looked like they're listening, they weren't listening, because their formation is such that it conduces to being in these hermetically sealed bubbles, which is why I think that rather than parceling out the arguments against celibacy or women in the church or women's ordination, I think we need to go right back to the very beginning of the nature of the relationship between us and challenge its very legality. Challenge its very legality. And ask them to engage with us in a debate about how is it that we are held as members of the church in this, what they regard as this unbreakable, unshakable relationship, when we know perfectly well from the human rights that we have, that we're actually entitled to walk away tomorrow morning. I could walk away from the church right now, this minute, if I wanted to, which I don't, but if I did, I could. And the church tells me, "Oh, you can't walk away." Even the excommunicated, we know, never. It's very hard to explain to people that when you're excommunicated, you're still a member, but you're just a member in bad standing. So I think that what we really have to do, Joanna, is to have more and more and more of events like this. And actually, in a way, the Synod on Synodality, ironically, is giving us that opportunity. I think the argument is ignore the 10, what was it they called, the 10 thematic nuclei from the Synod office. And now there will be an opportunity. at diocesan level for people to put their views and to make sure that these issues get on the agenda. And if they do not get on the agenda, that they write to the papers and they write themselves to the Synod office. See, the difficulty here is that here we have a process that looks like, information is going to go from the bottom all the way up. But we know that by the time it gets up, it's going to be so filtered and so sanitized and so homogenized that all those voices, those lovely, lovely, rebellious, dissenting, insightful voices with new ideas will have been long filtered out. And I'm going to suggest to all of those that as a precaution, that instead of just committing to the Synod on Synodality process, that they gather in groups as we are doing here and issue their own reports to the Synod of Bishops in Rome to make sure their views get on the agenda. Because they cannot be sure in the formal episcopal-led process, they won't be filtered out. But there's a tremendous opportunity to now get them on the agenda by having what I call local synodal groups like this. You might call them a bit like the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, the Fringe Synods, where the faithful make sure that they gather their views, put them into a report and send that directly to the Synod office in Rome. That's another possibility. And frankly, I think it's probably the only possible way that we don't end up with something like, for example, we had a diocesan synod in Limerick lately. We have a wonderful bishop there who tried his best, to encourage diocesan synod. And honestly, at the end of 2 years, I almost died of annoyance when I saw that after 2 years, in this talking about what you're allowed to talk about, the top recommendation was that there would be a cup of tea after Mass. I mean, that was so depressing, honestly, so depressing. So I was thinking to myself, and guess who'll be making the tea? And, that's not what we want from synodal processes, frankly. We need something altogether more interrogative, more penetrative, much more assertive of the beautiful grace of the gospel. So look, how do we talk to a hermetically sealed bubble? Well, we just keep pushing in the hope that somehow the pressure on them gives. That's all we can do. And I think there are some signs. I wouldn't want to say with great enthusiasm that the signs are wonderful, but I think the German Synod gives me great hope, to be honest. This Synod gives me great hope. And yeah, that's it. That's about it. Those are the signs of hope.
I think that's a brilliant and really exciting idea that this might be the beginning of a movement of synods, lay-led synods.
Well, there you heard it.
Because that, in a way, is the
canon
revolution.
law says it's our duty. It is our duty to let our sacred pastors know and to let each other know. So there's nothing to stop us. There is literally nothing to stop us from forming our own groups. Taking, for example, the synodal route that is being planned by Pope Francis and engaging with that if you want to, but also in parallel, running your own group that would send its own report directly to the Synod office in Rome to make sure it doesn't go through that secret sanitizing process that God knows what's going to come out the far end, probably just vanilla ice cream.
Thank you so much for that, Mary. The first question that we're going to go to from our online audience is somebody asking about Pope Francis. Is he really, well, what this person says is Pope Francis not restrained by a section of the church which often forces him to be conservative, which could explain his U-turns on several of his steps to make change? So is the Pope really himself a victim of other forces?
I have a different view on Pope Francis. I think he's blessed in his enemies who would make him look better than he is. That's the other way I look at it. He's blessed in his enemies who make him look at times liberal. He's also blessed in the hagiographers, who hang on to his every word and who parse his words in ways that he probably never intended, to try and extract from them the most liberal possible interpretation. He himself, he has said of himself with genuine honesty that he is a disorganized person. He's a very disorganized Pope. And the evidence is in of that. I mean, I don't need to rehearse all the times that he has said X, and then the Curie have had hysterics, and they've come behind him and said, no, what he meant actually was Y, which of course is completely conforms to church teaching. But I think on the whole, we have to say that he is a conservative leader. He's not a courageous man, I don't think, in terms of, he's never been courageous in terms of sitting behind his desk and saying, I'm going to write the document that says this is how it should be. I mean, actually, the document from CDF on blessings for gay couples says it all. It just says it all. This was a document that never had to be written. Didn't have to be written at all, but it was, and he authorized it. And that tells me really just how ultra conservative he really is. I mean, I don't see him as a great liberal reformer, but that said, I mean, there is that wonderful expression, the Lord works in mysterious ways. And in his own chaotic way, he kind of opens up spaces that allow us to work. But the real space that is being opened up is not by Pope Francis at all. It is by the great educated laity now asking the questions, all these years after Vatican II, asking questions about why the promise and the hopes and the expectations of Vatican II have all disappeared into that great dead end. And how did we end up with that clericalized magisterial episcopacy that created so much betrayal of our trust in so many ways? I'm thinking not just of clerical child sex abuse and institutional abuse, I'm thinking of all sorts of things, ways in which we have been betrayed. So I think that's where the real voices are coming from. And in a sense, Francis is really just responding to that, because of course right all across the world, including, you know, all in not too far from where you're all sitting now, the church is experiencing that ecclesial winter, people walking away. In Germany, 250,000 people walked away last year from the church, uncoupled themselves as they can through their civil law system. So yeah, Pope Francis, I don't find Pope Francis an inspirational man at all. At all. And one of the big disappointments for me, of course, a dreadful disappointment, was his visit to Ireland, kind of a nothing visit really in many ways. Here was a tremendous opportunity. All the Protestant churches had invited him to meet, you know, to go to Northern Ireland and to finish off that wonderful journey that had been made by Pope John Paul. And John Paul couldn't go to Northern Ireland because, you know, poor Lord Mountbatten had been murdered only a matter of weeks earlier. And all those poor soldiers were murdered in Warren Point only weeks earlier. It just wasn't feasible. But in the meantime, we've had the Good Friday Agreement and we've had peace. And we've had a community that has dedicated itself to trying to build the peace. And he didn't go. He didn't go. I mean, I look at that as an act of, and he was, you know, the Northern bishops tried to persuade him to go, but whoever, you know, his advisors are, they advised against it. And I thought that was such a wasted opportunity. So he's not, I don't think he's well advised. And I don't see him as a particularly courageous pope, really. But on the other hand, he's kind of chaotic, and I kind of like that. You know, I like the fact that he creates chaos, and in that chaos, he opens up space for dialogue and debate, and that's new, and that's what we're using.
So, from the Pope, we have a question here about the wider hierarchy. Our questioner asks, do you think that many of the hierarchy are afraid not of us, voices like the ones in this room, but of their own colleagues? They may actually be on the same page as many of the people in this room and listening, you know, and with us online, but they are terrified to speak out.
Yeah, I kind of hinted at that in the talk, that some of the people who have been treated most outrageously by the church through absence of due process, through silencing, have been clerics who've spoken out. And there is a culture, I mean, unfortunately, I think there is a culture that conduces to cowardice in the church, precisely because it silences so emphatically and so hurtfully those who decide, particularly those clergy, who decide to speak out. I mean, you look at the terrible treatment that's been meted out to a number of priests in Ireland. We've had a number of them, but also I think of Hans Kung, not that long dead, who was treated so abominably. Good people, and other people watch what's happened to them, and they say, I just don't have the courage for that. Or they say, I'll try and work within the system and do what I can and not invite that on myself, because if you invite it on yourself, perhaps you become excluded and you can't do the work that you believe is your mission in the world. So yes, I think that there are probably a lot of priests. I know, for example, that when my own son, who's gay, was married a few years ago, a huge number of priest friends, who are not madly radical people, rang us up to say that they would love to offer him a blessing. Now, he decided not to go that route because he didn't want to get them into trouble. And he knew that that they might get into trouble if it was found out. But so there is, I think there are many, many people who would love to have the freedom. And if the church could say tomorrow morning that all of those people have the right that God gave them to freedom of expression and freedom of speech, then I think this argument would be over. It would be over. The reason they remain silent is because they have bought into this idea that they can be silenced. Now, I don't think Christ really did he want apostles who were silenced by his own commandment to love one another? How did we get into this pickle? How did we ever create a church of magisterial cowards for Christ? I think that's something that, again, if we address the issue of human rights in the church, we open that door. We let the fresh air in. We make it easier for people to speak.
Now, there are a couple of questions here that are kind of looking ahead to where we go from here. And maybe I could go to one of those next. So this questioner says, power is only given by the majority. To effect change, the minority need to notice us. Should we withdraw our labour for us to be noticed? Who would make their tea? And I hear somebody saying, what about money?
And money and labour. Yeah, there are very few options left to us, really, because we don't have that standing forum in which to, in an ongoing way, make our voices heard. So the laity are reduced to either putting up with it, saying nothing and continuing, or doing what a lot of people are doing at the moment, which is walking away. Some people are withdrawing their labour. They're saying, no, I'm not going to get involved in that committee. I really don't want to get involved. Or they're saying, I'm not going to give money to X or Y. Or if I give money to the church, I'm only going to give it for the following purposes, to make sure that it's not used, for example, to enhance magisterial control. Or so all of the above. I think also, I'm just looking, for example, at, we had a recent example in Ireland of a document from our Episcopal Conference on, it was a document designed for catechesis in relation to sex education for primary level children. And there was quite a reaction from Catholic parents to it. And putting pressure on schools, for example, to say, because it was a voluntary document, it wasn't compulsory. And it was also a document that many people had difficulty with because of the way in which it presented marriage, and in particular in the way in which it presented homosexuality. So, because that was in complete conflict with our culture and our laws. I think we have an educated laity who are able to find ways now of talking back, as it were, of talking back. Money is already, I think, a major problem for the church. Money is, it's draining away from the church. And that is a measure of, it's not people saying, I want to be selfish or greedy. It's saying, I don't want to support something that I think is not consonant with my understanding of the great commandment to love one another, but is actually the opposite.
Absolutely, absolutely right. I was saying in a session I was speaking the other day that as a parent of 4 young women who were all raised as Catholics and who went to Catholic schools, but now none of them any longer they don't see it as the right thing to do, as the moral thing to do, and I have to constantly defend which I can only do thanks to taking part in events like this, really, how I can still call myself a Catholic. But the tragedy is that those young women and everybody in this room and everybody with us will know so many young people in this situation who are no longer going to be there to hear our voices and the voices of others.
I think that these voices are very important, Joanna, because the church has 1.3 billion people across 5 continents. There are whole cultures from which women are excluded. There are whole cultures which are criminalizing still gay men and women. And they draw strength from Catholic Church teaching. And it's so important that there are voices like ours which say, actually, we disagree with our church on this.
And also the voices of all these young people I'm talking about who are leaving the church are the very voices who want to question these. So it's a kind of double loss. Exactly. Mary, I'm now going to go to the people here gathered in Bristol. We've got a roving microphone and we've got time for at least a couple of questions. Could we ask you to keep them brief? I'm sorry, because we're always going to be struggling with time. So there's somebody here in a black jacket,
I just wanted to say that there are a lot of people who agree with us. There are also an awful lot of Catholics who are quite happy with the status quo. That's all. And how are you going to deal with them? How are you going to deal with them?
How are we going to deal with the people, Mary, who are opposed, and some of them very vehemently and trenchantly opposed to change in the church? They're Catholics too.
Well, they are, and they're entitled to their opinions. Absolutely, utterly. But one of the great things is, isn't it a wonderful thing, that people can change their minds. They can be persuaded to change their minds. They don't have to, of course, and they can stay in their... I think back to the same-sex marriage referendum in Ireland back in 2015, and my own mother, who's 90, daily mass, certainly now on the iPad. And she said to me, if I had a vote, which she didn't, because she was in Northern Ireland, we were in the Republic, and she said, but if I had a vote, I'd have to vote with the church. And a lot of people thought that, but then over the period of the discussion, and there was huge discussion, intergenerational discussion, respectful discussion, people had the opportunity, in particular, to listen to stories of other people whose voices in the past would have been immediately silenced, but down would have come the crozier. Here's the law of the church, end of. We have the answer to this. You don't need to explore any further. But on the television and video, these voices started to have their space and be heard. And people like my mother, for example, changed her mind. I was shocked on the day that we won the referendum when she rang me to say, isn't it wonderful that we won? And actually, to be honest, I hadn't heard the final result. And I thought for one horrific moment that we'd actually lost the blessed thing. She was so enthusiastic. And I said, well, who are we talking about here? And she said, no, we've won. And I said, well, have you changed your mind? And she said, oh, yes. She said, absolutely. Over the course of the debate, she had changed her mind. Why? Because there's a great Christian compassion and a depth in people that can be appealed to. And I would never, I'd never take anybody to task for holding those strong opinions that they're perfectly entitled to. But what you can take them to task for is refusing to debate them or discuss them. Because, we're open to having our minds changed as well and being persuaded. But I think one of the wonderful things about the human condition is the appealability of good ideas, that good ideas, things that have good integrity, have a power if we are prepared to make their case. And certainly there are many, many people in the church to whom we have to make that case. And we have to hope that they will listen. And this is where the voice of the Holy Spirit is very important, the prayer, because I wouldn't, many people who voted against, for example, the same-sex marriage referendum in Ireland, were people, of great faith and great prayer lives, and they're entitled. They're entitled. We're entitled to offer them the respect that we expect back for ourselves.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Should we take another?
More from the floor.
Okay, we're going to have one more question from the floor, maybe from this side of the room. There's somebody who's had her hand up who is quite near to you there. Yep. You're getting there, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Hello. May I just say to Mary that her experience as far as her mother's concerned, I had as a young medical student being told by the Catholic chaplain at my university that if we had a patient who required a hysterectomy, they had to go along to their parish priest and ask permission. I may say that I never went near the chaplaincy again. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you talk about the laity. Is there any route for the laity? Canon law, can that be challenged at all legally? Or are we in a situation where the Vatican State is a separate city, so nothing can be done? Because it does seem that they are just, they're flouting everything with regard to human rights. Thank you.
Mary.
Yeah. That's the whole problem here. The forum doesn't exist for feedback from the bottom up. And in a way, it doesn't exist. That's the bottom line. We have no power to change canon law. The only person actually who can change canon law is the Pope. He's the chief legislator, the only supreme legislator. He could change it, or indeed a Vatican Council could change it. And many of those have we had in my lifetime, one. And so the Pope is the chief legislator. He can change canon law. But here's the thing. I think this is what I'm encouraged by in he having called this synod on synodality. Because now we can get the message across to people. And indeed, one of the most useful things the Synod of Bishops office said was that it would accept direct correspondence from the faithful, precisely because canon law says that we have the right and the duty to draw the attention of our sacred pastors, things that we think need to be said for the good of the church. So if we reference this canon, which is canon 212.3, if we reference that canon and say that in response to that we are now making a direct report to the Synod of Bishops on synodality, and we want this to be taken into consideration, I think that we could actually probably swamp the Synod office with useful stuff rather than the stuff they're going to get from the Episcopal conferences, which is going to be so sanitized really as to be, pretty much, dull and worthy and not very useful.
Mary, we've got time, sadly, for only one more question. And I'm going to slightly paraphrase. Where was that question about Mary herself? I think. Anyway, the person was, the questioner was saying, Mary, you have done so well in Irish politics. You're not going to let these guys in Rome get the better of you, are you? You're going to win this fight.
Absolutely not. No, I mean, I'm so lucky that I have the freedom to speak. And I think that's a wonderful thing to have. And I have the passion for the church. I mean, my own kids say to me, why do you stay? And sometimes I ask myself that, but the seed is there. And I look at, in particular, I remember the people who helped me on my own faith journey. The wonderful priests and some nuns, and in particular the people of God, the faithful. They were all laity. My grannies, who were prayerful people who just got on with it, but who, if they were here now, wouldn't be piocious, wouldn't be, as they say, eating the altar rails, but would be saying, "Hang on a minute, when I look back on my life now, there are things that I would like to have changed. Why didn't I have a voice?" I look back now, I listened to my 90-year-old mother, who they had those 11 pregnancies and who had that dreadful experience with our parish priest, and who, now, if I was Pope Francis, I wouldn't want to be calling into her for a cup of tea now, because she'd have a few things to say to him. And I feel that pressure now there are loads of people like that who never had the chance to speak, and we have it. We are Newman's educated laity, and while the forum doesn't exist in the church for us to speak, there's actually nothing to stop us from doing what was done here, to set up this forum of our own and speak from it on our terms, not on terms set by the Curia or the Magisterium or the Synodal Office, who seem to think that you can have. You can say to people, oh, what affects all will be discussed by all, but here's what you're going to discuss, you know. I mean, no, we're saying, well, actually, we've our own idea, you know, and maybe you'd like to hear them. Whether you like it or not, we're going to hear each other, and then we're going to send our report to you, because in canon law, you are obliged to receive it. So let's send those reports in from all over the world.
You're going to go wrap up.
Mary, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. I don't think I would have stayed on this journey if it hadn't been for your, the inspiration of you. And I think there are many, many people who share that feeling. Thank you for everything you do. And I think it's often very difficult. And I think you're, incredibly impressive. And many people have been saying that on our forum this afternoon. So thank you from all of us here.
Sorry I couldn't be there. I'd love to be there to have a cup of tea now with everybody. But
we'll have another one.
God bless everybody and good luck. May God go with us all.